It's a beautiful day. First day of autumn is in 2 days, although today it feels like we have already arrived. A little chilly out there. But been about 6 months since I've stood in this position, and I'm glad to be back, I think. And hopefully you are too. So anyway, today we're going to be in the book of Genesis, and we're having a sale today. You're going to get 3 lessons for the price of 1. So since we didn't have Sunday school for the 2 previous Sundays, we're going to go flying through those chapters to get to today's text. And it's all about the life of Joseph, is what we're going to cover. And so today's lesson is in Genesis chapter 42. Its title is Victorious Love, and the overarching theme for the whole quarter is love for one another. And so that's where we are. So in this set of lessons, right, the ones that we're going to go through fairly rapidly today, and then the one to conclude the study of Joseph next Sunday, I would think that the appropriate verse that covers all of this is actually in the New Testament. It should be a familiar voice, a verse to you all. It's Romans 8:28. Anyone can quote that to me right off the top of their head? And we know that in all things God works. Is it bringing you to your memory? We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Ooh, feedback. So, God is always working to carry out his plan for you and for his larger purpose for the world. He's always working, even though in the moment where you are, it may not be immediately evident that that's what's going on, but God is faithful and he's always working. And I think that is something to keep in mind in the life of Joseph in these chapters that we're going to cover today and next Sunday. So before we get started, let's pray. We thank you, O Lord, for this beautiful day and this opportunity to be here in your house and the fellowship of the believers. We just pray, God, that your words would come alive, that the truth here in the Bible will be revealed to us today, that what you have to say will be heard. We just pray, Lord, your blessing upon us now, that your Spirit would lead us and teach us. We thank you for your great love and your mercy, O Lord. Amen. Okay, so we're going to start actually in chapter 37, which is where the first of these lessons begins, right? So the title of that lesson is actually Biased Love. I'm looking, I have my reading glasses on, so you're all warm and fuzzy. Those of you who have children with multiple siblings, do you have a favorite among those siblings? Maybe you do and maybe you don't. You should. You might. So, they might think you do. It's like, yeah. You always do. Yeah. You know, you love your children the same, but they're all different, right? They are so different. Well, in this particular case, Joseph was a favorite son. So we're going to read this first bit, the first bit of chapter 37. I'm just going to read it to you. In 37 verse 2, we see like the 10th occurrence of this phrase. This is the account of, in this case, it's Jacob. So it says, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream. He told it to his brothers. "Listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." This is a 17-year-old boy. When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing the flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come, let's kill him, throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, the gift from his father, and they took him and threw him into the cistern that was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So we're going to stop there. What do you think of this story? For a smart what?
I said for a smart guy, he wasn't too smart.
For a smart guy, it wasn't too smart. How so?
His brothers all these
Yeah.
stories about how they're bowing
Bowing down to him, you know. And he's the youngest, right? And they're like, what? I mean, there's a significant age gap between, Reuben and Joseph. There's a problem in this family, right, that goes actually back a long, long time, right? So Joseph was the favorite son, right? He was the firstborn of the favorite wife, Rachel, right? You remember the story of, Jacob going to Laban and he says, "I'm going to marry Rachel." And then Laban goes, "No, you're going to marry Leah." And so pulls a fast one on him, but he favors Rachel all those years, right? And so you can go back into Genesis 29 to 30 and sort of read this sometimes comical story, and some of just sad, of how all these brothers were born. So Joseph was favored, right? Jacob didn't even try to hide it. But if you go back through it, right, it's a history in the family, right? So Jacob was favored by Rebekah, right? But Esau was favored by Isaac. And further back, Sarah and Abraham favored Isaac over Ishmael. So this bias has existed in his family. Now, God has intervened in this family multiple times, right? He chose, Abraham, he chose Isaac, and he chose Jacob. to carry out his promises. But still in the family, right, here is this trouble of the bias that's there in you, and it's really emphasized there in verses 3 through 8, right? They're so jealous and so angry with Joseph in the situation, it says, we're going to kill this guy, their own brother, their half-brother. We got to get rid of him, right? Just because we really can't stand him anymore. So that hate festered into sin, but Reuben, hopefully being older and wiser, says, well, let's not do this, and even has purpose in his mind that he's going to rescue Joseph and take him back to Dad. So they carry out the plan that's there and take his beautiful robe, the gift from their father. They bloody it up. Joseph is now in a cistern. And so once you've thrown somebody into a big hole in the ground, what's your natural response to that? Well, it's to sit down and eat lunch. And who comes along? A merchant caravan, right? Ishmaelites. We would call them Arabs now. And now a better idea occurs, right? Well, let's sell him, right? It's like we can get money for this. So we still get rid of him, but, he's not dead. And it's like, well, that's a great idea. But now they need a cover story. They take the beautiful coat, bloody it up with goat's blood. They take it back to their father, and they lead him to believe that Joseph is now dead. And his grief, is very great, right? So then this chapter concludes with this. It says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. The bodyguard of Pharaoh, the guy who runs that, now owns Joseph. So, that's the essence of the first lesson that we have here, of biased love, right? And the trouble that it causes. But God's hand is in this whole thing the whole time. He's directing a plan that was set forth years and years ago. But here's a question for you. Food for thought. Going back to the Romans verse, that God works all things for the good of those who love him and who are called. If you can picture yourself in Joseph's situation, what's going through your mind? Your siblings all hate you. They've just gotten rid of you and sold you into slavery. What are you thinking? Bad situation. So, and he's sort of stuck in it, right? And he's like, well, what did I do? If you were in a similar circumstance, would you find it difficult to believe what Paul would write centuries later, right? That God works all things for good. You just got hauled out of your own country, probably never going to see your family again. You're now a slave in a foreign country where you don't speak the language. Yeah. It's like, what did that dream mean, right? It's like, well, how's that going to... It's like, God, are you fooling me? Right? I don't know. It's hard to imagine what he's thinking, but in the midst of this sort of collapse of his world around him, of what he thought was going to happen, is now something very different than he had imagined. So he's going to have to trust God. Same as any of us, right? When the thing you thought was going to happen doesn't happen the way you thought it was going to, doesn't work out, what's the promise? God is always faithful. God has promised, right? He will work it out for the good of those who love him and those who he has called. Well, he's called Joseph. Joseph loves God. He serves it. We're going to see that here in the next lesson. So, how we're doing good. The next lesson, actually, takes up in chapter 41. And the title of that lesson is Obedient Love. And it opens up smack in the middle of the chapter with now Joseph standing before Pharaoh. And if you just stopped right there, you went, well, now wait a minute. He was just sold into slavery. How in the world is he standing in front of Pharaoh? Well, you got to read chapters 39 and 40 to figure out. And so we're going to summarize those as we go through, right? So chapter 38 has a very sordid tale involving his brother Judah, which we will not cover, but now we'll get to 39. So, obedient love. I would say that a better title for this lesson would be Bloom Where You Are Planted, right? Bloom where you're planted. Things don't turn out quite right. Maybe you get located from one coast to the other. Bloom where you are. So here we go. 39 verse 1. It says, here's the summary of what happened. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Okay, so Moses, the compiler of this book, has connected it back. And a most important verse, I think this is key here. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. This phrase is going to be repeated a number of times here. The Lord was with Joseph. And that is key, right? So he is very successful. We're going to come down as we go. He says, when his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. What a remarkable testimony to this young man, right? This Hebrew slave is so talented and so gifted, he's now managing all of the affairs and the comings and goings of the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Amazing, right? Well, how did that happen? Back to verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, right? Joseph was enabled by God, in all that he did. And Potiphar saw that, right? This great gift that Joseph possessed, that God was with him and gave him success and gave him ability. This Egyptian, this pagan man, most likely, saw the evidence of God in Joseph, in the way he conducted himself, in what he did. God made him successful. God also made him good looking, right? Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." So, complication now in his story. To put it into today's verbiage, Joseph is now subjected to repeated instances of sexual harassment, right, and unwanted sexual advances by the mistress of the house, right? So Potiphar's wife notices Joseph, young, handsome man. It's like, But Joseph being the man of integrity, as evidenced by the prosperity that he had, that God blessed him with, a man of integrity who, he asks her, well, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And also, how could I disrespect my master this way? So he refuses her repeatedly. And then one day, he's in the house, nobody else is there, She comes after him again, and to get away, right, man, he has to slip out of his jacket and leaves her, holding his coat. That gives her the opportunity now, in her anger, to accuse him falsely. And so he ends up in prison, right? I had read somewhere in preparation for this lesson that there was some evidence that adultery was a capital offense in Egypt at this time. So this accusation is there. So Joseph's now in danger for his life, but he is so good at what he does that Potiphar, I think, probably gives him the benefit of the doubt. And so he's angry. Maybe he was angry that he's having to get rid of a great manager. But Mrs. Potiphar is not going to jail, so Joseph is. So he goes. Another twist of events, right, for Joseph. Right? Again, it's like, this is not how I thought this was turning out, right? God is still working. Don't worry, Joseph. It's going to be okay. So that key phrase appears again, right? In chapter 39, verse 21, the Lord was with him in the prison. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. I think this is a funny irony, right? The warden, who's supposed to be in charge of this, right? He's the one who is supposed to run the daily operations of the king's prison. Hands it all off to a prisoner. So Joseph is running the prison in which he is a prisoner. That is just a strange irony to me. But why, right? God was with Joseph. Blesses what he does. And again, we see another example of a man, the warden, seeing in Joseph the great gifts of God in his life, right? To help him in the situation where he's in. Joseph is obedient. God blesses him and now gives him all this responsibility, and he handles it very well. Well, the story moves along. We're still trying to get to how did Joseph end up in front of Pharaoh in chapter 41? Well, that's going to be revealed here in chapter 40, how that could come about. So, while he's in prison, two guys show up, the king's baker and the king's cupbearer, right? The people who feed the king and give the king his wine. They also happen to be the ones in charge of making sure the king doesn't get poisoned. They end up in the prison because they offend the king. And so while they're there, they have disturbing dreams, right? And Joseph, in his daily walk around, his management by wandering around philosophy, comes to them out of concern, sees them, the consternation on the face. He says, "Why are your faces so sad today?" And he said, "We both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph says, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So, first, way back in his life, Joseph was given dreams by God. And now God has given them the ability to hear other people's dreams and tell them what they mean. When God is speaking to them, revealing to them something, God empowers Joseph to figure this out. So, these two men tell him of their dreams. And Joseph says, well, to the cupbearer, things are going to work out okay for you, right? The king's going to call you back into service. And the one thing that I ask of you is this: when you get back there, please put in a good word for me, because I've been in prison unjustly, right? I should not be here. So please, right, when you see the king, put in a word for me. The baker, his interpretation wasn't so good. In fact, on Pharaoh's birthday, they were both brought out of the prison. The cupbearer was restored, and the baker was executed. But then the sad thing happens in verse 23. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot. Poor Joseph. Well, God's still working. Don't worry, Joseph. Chapter 41 opens up with this verse. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. So, this guy forgets for 2 years. Now, Pharaoh has these 2 disturbing dreams, asks his magicians, his counselors, the wise men, everybody know that he can think of who might be able to tell him what they mean. And you remember the dreams, right? You had the 7 fat cows and the 7 emaciated cows, and you had the 7 plump heads of grain and the withered heads of grain, and where the skinny cows ate the fat cows, but you couldn't even tell that the skinny cows had eaten the fat cows. And there was nothing left but withered grains after they devoured the plump grains. So everybody's like, well, I don't know what that means. So Pharaoh's trying to find an answer to this. And all of a sudden, the cupbearer's like, oh, yeah, I know this Hebrew guy down in the jail, and oh man, I forgot all about him. But that guy can interpret dreams, right? So you should call him. So what happens? Pharaoh summons Joseph. This is in 41:16. He calls him up, or 41:15, brings him up. Joseph is cleaned up, gets shaved, put on a nice new pair of clothes, starts walking like an Egyptian again, goes in. Pharaoh says, you can interpret my dream. And Joseph's response is classic, right? He says, well, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. God will interpret your dream. He'll reveal it to me. So here's Joseph's obedience, right? He knows where his blessings come from. He knows where his gifts have derived from. They have come from God, and he's going to tell this pagan king what his dreams mean. Well, he tells him, he says, you remember the interpretation, right? We learned all this Sunday school when we were children, right? The 7 fat cows and the 7 plump heads of grain mean there are going to be 7 years of great abundance and plenty in the land of Egypt. The 7 skinny cows and the 7 withered grains say and after that, there's going to be a famine so severe in the land that everybody is going to forget about all those years of abundance. It's just going to be gone. So that was the interpretation, and at that moment, Joseph could have said, well, I guess you can send me back to the jail now. And Pharaoh could have said, okay, well, thanks for the information. We'll handle it from here. But that's not what happened. God now has not only given Joseph knowledge about the dream, he's also given him the answer to deal with it, what is going to happen. And so his comment in verse 36, after he tells him, this is what you need to do, right? He says, gives him the answer. He says, let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all of that food in the good years and store it under the authority of Pharaoh. He says, do this so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. So he gives them a plan. So he moves now from knowledge into wisdom. There's a difference between those two things. You can be aware of a lot of facts, but you have no idea what to do with them. You lack wisdom. Well, God has given Joseph wisdom how to respond to the upcoming famine, knowing what's taking place. So he's given them the plan. You're going to lay a 20% tax on everybody, a grain tax essentially. All the abundance of the land is going to be stored up, knowing what's coming. And what's it say? The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all the officials. And they're like, no, it's a great idea. So Pharaoh asked them, this is verse 38, can we find anyone like this man, Joseph, one in whom is the spirit of God. And it's important to note here that this is the first time in the Bible that it is acknowledged that the Spirit of God is dwelling in a man, that God's own Spirit has revealed to someone. This is the first time in the Bible it's noted. God's Spirit is with Joseph. Pharaoh recognizes it. This pagan king that worshiped, I don't know how many different deities that they had in Egypt at this time. Lots of them, which you actually read about in the book of Exodus. Lots of deities worshipped by this pagan king. But he sees the evidence of the Spirit of the Creator God, the God, in Joseph. So Joseph has this great idea, and they're like, okay, well, we need to find a guy to run all of this. And he says, okay, that would be you, Joseph. And so in 41, it's kind of interesting, verse 41, it says, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, had him ride in a chariot as the second in command, and men shouted before him, make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Now remember, Joseph, a young Hebrew man, a slave, when he woke up that morning, he was in jail. When he went to bed that night, he's the prime minister of Egypt, ruler of the whole land by decree of the Pharaoh. Do you find that amazing? That is truly a God-sized accomplishment. It's like God says, I have a plan to fulfill. My guy at the moment to fulfill the plan is Joseph, and I'm going to make this happen. And so he did. Joseph now in charge of the whole land of Egypt when he was had been a Hebrew slave only hours before. Amazing. All a testimony to God's blessing on Joseph, how God has chosen him for this purpose. And what happened? Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Remember, he went in he was sold into slavery at the age of 17. Now he's 30 years old. Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. God is now blessing the land of Egypt, filling those storehouses with grain. I imagine they had to also have a building project to build more storage to hold the blessing that God is pouring out in Egypt that Joseph foretold, right? So he's managing all of this. And during this time before the famine comes, Joseph has two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then the crucial verse 53, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. And there was famine in all of the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When the famine spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. Not told what the nature of the famine was, whether it was drought or pestilence or exactly why, but for 7 years, the harvest was going to be terrible. People were going to be starving. So, but the land of abundance, because of God revealing to Joseph what was going to happen, and because of the blessing of God, they're ready for it. And so finally we arrive in today's text. So, with all those countries coming, well, the land of Canaan is also experiencing famine. So in chapter 42, so today's lesson is titled Victorious Love. And it starts off actually in verse 6. It says, now Joseph was the governor of the land. It's like, okay. But if you back up into verse 1 of chapter 42, when Jacob, Joseph's father now, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. And so they go. Who do they know could be in Egypt? And how did he get there? These 10 brothers, 20 years or so before this, carried out a fateful action. And so here at this point, I think when he says, why are you looking at each other? I think you might say, why are you looking at me that way? When he says, I need you to go to Egypt to buy some grain. And they all went, Egypt. Don't really want to go to Egypt. That's got some bad thoughts for us there. 20 years. It's been in their mind what happened before. But they go down. And this is where the whole text comes up. So here we are. We're just going to power through. Well, we're going to go through this in chunks now, okay? So here we go. They go down. And so starting in verse 6, he says, now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. We'll find out later in this little section that he is speaking to them through an interpreter. So he's speaking to them, he's addressing them in Egyptian, not in Hebrew, right? And he's going to look very different now, right? He's going to have no beard because the Egyptians were clean shaven, right? He's going to have on all the royal finery we read about, what Pharaoh put on him. The gold and the fine linen. He's probably got some interesting headgear on. Got the cool mascara and eyeliner. You know, he's standing like this. Maybe. Listening to the Bangles. I don't know. But he's there. Not recognized by them. He's also 21 years older, approximately, right? Because they're in the first year of the famine. You add all this up. So he's now close to 40 years old. Person looks a little bit different going from 17 to the age of 40. My son was telling me yesterday, or the day before, he was looking at this picture of me that was taken in 1989, the day that my dad and I rolled my 1966 Mustang out of the garage after having spent the summer restoring it and painting it. Beautiful car. I loved that car. We had to I gave it to my nephew in Texas before we moved out here. But I have a picture of me standing here. I'm sort of leaning on the car like this, right? And he looks at that, and so in 1989, I was 25 years old. So, and I am going to be 56 in 2 months. So I changed a little in that period of time. Hair is a different color. There's a little less of it now. There's more of this. Time changes a man and a woman over a period of time. So, you know, and plus that, right, he's dressed differently. He's not dressed as a shepherd anymore. They don't recognize him. He recognizes them. They didn't change that much. They were already older. They didn't change that much. So I just got to wonder, it's like, what was Joseph thinking at this point? Especially when you get to verse 9. Then he remembered his dreams about them, bowing down. You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. No, your servants have come to buy food. We're all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. No, you have come to see where our land is unprotected. Why do you think Joseph acted this way? Remember, this question popped up in every, it pops up here, every background text I looked at. Everybody's like, why this? Why accuse them of being spies? Any thoughts among this audience? You're spies, even though he knows they're his brothers. Is he just messing with them? Is he truly angry? I don't know. I think that, it's like, well, I don't know. I have no idea. You're spies. I think he might, in one sense, be acting the part of the prime minister of Egypt, right? You got a group of 10 guys all coming together, all traveling, and you're like, you could be scoping us out, right? Trying to figure out how you're going to steal our riches in the midst of this famine. That could be a legitimate thing. But maybe he's trying to put them off guard. I don't know. So we get back into the story. He says, your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Interesting. Joseph was still alive when they traded him off to the Ishmaelites. And they have convinced themselves over 20 years, well, he's got to be dead by now, right? Got to be. I mean, a slave isn't going to last long. They have convinced themselves, and they've harbored this guilt in their heads for 2 decades. Joseph hears this, and he says, it is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. And if you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. Penalty for espionage is probably death. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back to your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die. This they proceeded to do. Okay, so Joseph, after 3 days, stepped back and had a new thought. It's like, okay, I'll keep one of you guys back as a hostage. The rest of you go, and you bring back your brother, his full brother, Benjamin. So he's showing them some mercy here, right? Because he, as prime minister, he can say, you're out, you're done, no grain for you. In fact, you're all going to die. He could have done that, but he didn't. Yeah, we're not telling. Hey, that's much nicer than that buzzer. So they said to one another, and here's something interesting. Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen, and that is why this disaster, this distress has come upon us. Reuben replied, Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. And now we must give an accounting for his blood. They all believe he's dead. They've been carrying this guilt with them for 2 decades. 20 years ago, right, this event happened, and now it's being discovered, right? It's being worked out. It's like this sinful act they committed, they have carried this secret and this burden all of these years, but Joseph is about to free them from it. And here's something interesting. They did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter, and all the emotion of that day and the emotion of this moment becomes a bit much. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then turned back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey home. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and they left. So they went back home to their father without Simeon. Joseph is still giving evidence here by this action. It's like you're giving him grain free of charge. He still loves his brothers, apparently. Giving them provisions to go home. And this story concludes next week. So there's your teaser to come back. But I want to ask you this question. This is kind of interesting as you go through here, this particular story. Why is the story of Joseph in the Bible? Why? Think about that. Come back next week with an answer. There'll be a quiz. So, any thoughts before we conclude? We have 2 minutes. Story of Joseph. Oh, yeah. 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 So he's buying time, essentially. He's like, yep. Yeah. That could be. Spirit of God was with him. Yeah. Yeah. It all came back, right? As I said, 9, he says, he remembered the dreams, right? You know, he says, yeah, you're all going to bow down to me. And here he's standing, and there they are. And God brings to his remembrance because God is still with him, right? As I noted, all this, God was with Joseph. He's still with him at this point, right? Carrying out God's plan. So, yeah, he's like, Spirit of God telling him, it's like, here's the way we're going to deal with this situation. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's kind of an interesting thing. The conflict inside him had to have been there. You know, are you angry? He could have carried out vengeance on them, but he didn't. Because I don't think he was a vindictive man. He bloomed where he was planted, right? He did what God had for him to do. And the blessing of God was on him, and everybody around him saw it. I think that's kind of a neat message for us, right? As you go about in your daily life, that people around you would see God working in you, that the blessing upon your life can be extended to them. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Because now our screen's gone black, which I guess means we're out of time. So, come back next week. We'll conclude the life of Joseph. Go in peace, everyone.